Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for part 2 of our story. If you haven't heard part 1, don't hesitate to click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the story. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. I don't know why it is, but after the brutal cruelty of a long drawn-out insufferable winter, where the objectionable temperatures had been as cold as -13 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving Grandpa Otis exceedingly disenchanted, the satisfying feel of that bright, radiant, audacious sunshine brushing against my skin was like a warm, very welcome, pleasant nudge. Let's just say there was nothing quite like it. No sooner than when I'd thrown out my line, where I'd attached one of my father's juicy worms to the end, I could feel an immediate tug as something had been zealously seduced by my worm. I gallantly wrestled with something that wiggled and oscillated frenziedly at the end of my line. I wound it in slowly, to discover I'd caught a sizable, shiny grey-pink salmon. This thing was huge. After I pulled it out of the lake, it flapped frantically, until I skillfully put it out of its misery with a stone. I then set to work, gutting and filleting it on my portable plastic board, as fastidiously and meticulously as my prudent father had taught me. Then I placed it carefully in the top lining of my wicker basket, with an eager anticipation that more would soon follow. The day seemed to hold within its voluptuous grasp the unspoken promise of an auspicious outcome. I was very impressed with myself, giving myself a self-congratulatory high five. I continued to fish, pulling in a couple more salmon, one after the other. It was looking like an excellent start. I chuckled with glee at my dazzling performance, sitting back confidently on my chair, with a little bit of a haughty swagger, I'm not ashamed to admit. The sunshine that filtered across my face made me sleepy, and a nasty fly began to buzz over my eyes. I slapped it, killing the thing instantly. It rolled off my skin and dropped down on the wooden decking of the pier. I suddenly sat up with a start, looking over my shoulders apprehensively, as I was gripped with a bodeful feeling that clawed at my insides like a crab's pincers, and left my hair on the back of my neck standing up on edge. I got the foreboding sense that I was not alone, and that I was being watched by a pair of menacious eyes that drilled into me like a jackhammer. Then I saw him. He was standing upright against a tall sculptural tree that seemed to have distorted, twisted, crooked claws for boughs, and rude arthritic roots that scandalized the forest floor with their gnarled, nodulous, contorted appendages that were almost as unsightly as the hideously heinous, evil-looking eyes of the man that impertinently intruded on my field of vision, like a nasty splodge of red paint on a pristine canvas. I swear to you, this man's menacing, deep-set eyes were blood red, and when he smiled at me briefly, it looked like his mouth was filled with razor-sharp, jagged fangs. But as he got closer towards me, his teeth looked normal. Had I imagined those fangs, I wondered? Was my mind playing strange tricks on me? As he moved towards me, the bright smile in his face got wider, but there was something about him that sent chills and shivers running down my spine. Who was he, I wondered? What was he doing on my father's land? There was something about this man that made me want to run away as fast as I could. But for some inexplicable, unfathomable reason, I held my ground as he made his approach. I will admit that every part of me was wobbling like a jelly.
"Hello, fisher boy," he said to me. "I see you are out here fishing alone. Where are your father and grandfather today? Were they not supposed to accompany you this morning for your fishing expedition? It seems like such a dreadful shame that you're out here all on your lonesome.
His voice was raspy, like the hideous, unwelcome voice you might receive from an unknown caller when you're in your house alone, that sends the fear of God coursing through your veins. He had that kind of unsettling, outer-worldly voice. I was stunned. How did this man know about my father and my grandfather? How could he know so much about me and about our fishing expedition when I knew nothing about him at all? I'd never seen him a day in my life. My parents had about as many friends as you could count on one hand. But no, this incongruous stranger, I'd never seen him before a day in my life. And there was something oddly disquieting and rather airy about him that I didn't like. It was like an instinctive sixth sense bubbled up to the surface, like the sparkling bubbles in an effervescent bottle of champagne, warning me that something was seriously off here, and that this idiosyncratic stranger was not whom he appeared to be, but something infinitely more sinister. "They've gone to town," I explained. "My grandfather's got a mole on his arm that needs checking out. But they'll be back any minute now," I said hurriedly. "They'll be joining me very soon."
"Why do you lie, little fisher boy?" said the man, rolling his words like butter in his mouth. "Why do you lie so easily on that little tongue of yours? Did your parents not teach you better than that?" His words were gravelly, his tone coarse and croaky.
"I'm not lying," I said gingerly.
"Oh, but you are, young man. Your grandfather and father have gone to town. They'll be gone for a long time, will they not? But you decided to come fishing on your own accord. You're a naughty little fisher boy, are you not? Your parents will not be pleased with you. You're out here on your own. I mean, anything could happen to you."
The emphasis on the last words, "anything could happen to you," were almost unnerving. It was almost like he purred with a smug satisfaction when he said them. "Who are you?" I asked nonplussed. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before a day in my life."
"But that does not matter, does it, fisher boy? I know all about you. And I know that your grandfather Otis has just died from a dreadful mole that he's had on his arm. More's the pity."
I could see the red, greedy glint in his beady brown eyes as he tormented me, and for a second I got a glimpse of the fangs that suddenly became normal teeth again in the twinkling of an eye, almost as if this strange man was giving off some kind of holographic projection, when very suddenly the hologram would become distorted and I'd get a glimpse of something else hiding behind the masked facade, something clearly not human. "You lie! My grandfather had a mole. He wouldn't die from it, not straight away. And anyway, it may not even be cancer."
"Oh, but he did die, young man. Only a few minutes ago."
I can feel indignant tears welling up in the corner of my eyes. It couldn't be true, could it? My Gramps had discovered a nasty mole on his arm this morning. Surely it wouldn't kill him outright. But this strange man seemed to know so much. Supposing it was true. Supposing after the doctor cut the mole out of my grandfather's arm, he dropped down dead. My grandfather didn't like the sight of blood. Maybe it wasn't the mole that killed him, but the shock of seeing all the blood during his local anaesthetic. My father used to say that shock could easily kill. I'd seen it with little indigenous wild animals myself, often enough out here in Alaska, and even a little bird that Spotted Dick caught once. I rescued it, but despite my very best efforts to save it, the shock of its grueling encounter with our cat had almost certainly killed it. I watched the man walking over to my wicker basket.
"I'm very, very hungry," he said, rubbing his stomach. "Very hungry. What have we got here?" he said, opening the lid of my wicker basket to inspect the contents. To my horror, he pulled out my filleted fish
and swallowed the pieces of fish whole, one by one.
Pity there weren't any bones in here. I rather enjoy bones.
I stared at him, thinking that I'd never seen a human eat like that before, nor had any human behaved in this outlandish, presumptuous way over raw fish, or just helped themselves to somebody else's catch. It was so rude, I thought.
Trouble is, young man. Well, fisher boy, he said to me, that was only hors d'oeuvres for me. I have in mind for myself a far more satisfactory, substantial meal.
For a moment his eyes grow red as they land on me, and I can see drool spilling down the corners of his mouth, and that drool is hungry. It's in that moment I realise what this man's intentions are. He wants to eat me. Are you kidding me? I don't know how I knew this. It sounds insanely bizarre. But there was this sense of knowing that washed over every single cell of my body, like a smoke detector going off, sending alarm bells ringing loudly in my gut. I could feel panic seizing up in my veins. Oh, just shooting up, with no restraint. And then I knew exactly what I needed to do. I knew this like I know the grass is green and the sky is blue. I needed to get the hell out of here, the hell away from this man. He's wearing blue jeans and a blue plaid shirt, but lunges towards me. But I dive into the lake without any delay. One thing I do know is how to swim, and how to swim very well. But the man has plunged into the water after me. I found myself panic swimming to the edge of the lake. The powerful adrenaline rush gave me that vital life-saving edge over my nimble pursuer. I stumble awkwardly out of the water as fast as I can, trying to shake as much water as I can off my body. My body is soaked to the skin, my drenched clothes clutching to my skin tightly, my hair sticking to my face. My heart thunders violently in my chest, like shooting stars taking off. The water is freezing, and I am shivering. I crawl over the mud on my hands and knees, panting desperately like a dog. I keep my body close to the ground, terrified of being seen. Never was I more grateful that my clothes were tan this morning. As my father always believed, even when you were fishing you should be camouflaged to blend in with the environment. He had a sense that maybe the fish could pick up colour. I scramble on my fours over the mud, staggering awkwardly like an intoxicated drunken sailor, lifting myself up behind a spruce tree, where I take cover. Water is dribbling off me like a garment on the washing line that hasn't been wrung out sufficiently well. I'm freezing cold, terribly afraid. I clandestinely peer through the branches stealthily, holding my breath in case that can be heard. I see the horrible man that had chased me swimming to the edge of the lake. I can see the moving water rippling as this long vertical form charges through the water with the grace of an otter. It's not the man that I see rising from the water, but a monstrous creature of over 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, with a Bigfoot-like body, but with brown hair like an otter's, smooth and sleek, clinging to his body tightly, with a waterproof oily film. When it opens its mouth, I can see these horrifying jagged teeth that I had witnessed before, and I would recognise those red eyes anywhere. The man that I'd seen moments before was really a monster in disguise, hiding behind a 3-dimensional hologram with the head of an otter. Was this really happening? Somehow he'd managed to hide his true appearance behind me, with some kind of cloaking, repatterning system that had changed his appearance altogether. This huge, very brawny creature stands up straight and erect like a ruler. He scans the water with his beady eyes for any sign of movement, any ripples, but he sees nothing. The water remains still. He appears befuddled and bewildered that I could have been such an efficient swimmer that had escaped his grasp. But had I really? All you can hear is the sounds of the bird song tweeting through the valley. I am so terrified that I continue to hold my breath. The creature begins to search for me frantically. I can tell he's furious to have been outsmarted by me. I'm pretty sure he will find me very soon. How am I going to get away from here? My heart is pounding violently in my chest with heavy drum beats. I'm so affrighted that I don't even feel the coldness that has seeped through my skin from the icy water and my soggy feet that are squishing around in my shoes. Then I hear voices, familiar voices that are sweet-sounding. It's my grandfather and my father's voice.
Why the hell would he go fishing on his own like this? What a naughty boy. Well, you know, George, he can be quite industrious at times, came my grandfather's voice. We should commend him for that.
Oh, goodness, my grandfather was alive. My heart jumped for joy, and then I audaciously ran towards the two men as quickly as I could. But they weren't there. I realized I'd walked into a cunning trap. For some reason, the clever creature, hiding behind a human mask, had successfully managed to mimic my grandfather and father's voices, to lure me out of my hiding place. How could he do that? How could he be this clever? This is masterful trickery that would deceive most, and certainly had fooled me. That is when the creature mocks me.
You think you could hide from me, little fisher boy? You really did. Nobody gets to hide from me.
He lunges towards me. I'm freaking out. My heart shrieks in my chest. My feet turn into concrete blocks. I run with squishing water in my boots from the swimming adventure that makes my run precariously cumbersome and very unproductive. I can't run like this. Oh my God, I'm going to die. I just know it. I'm going to die. I'm really freaking out, screaming at the top of my lungs, really screaming. I don't think I've ever screamed like that before. And believe me, the sound that emanated from the back of my throat could have woken the living dead. Then my biggest fear is realized. The impending dread that I so desperately tried to avoid had abruptly hemorrhaged itself into my life. In a trice, this vile, repugnant creature grabs me, throws me on his back. I try to fight back, but everything happens so fast, like an accident that is beyond your control or ability to stop. I'm certain I'm already dead, although I don't see my life flashing before me, as you might expect. But I do find myself regretting that I'd gone fishing on my own like this. I knew unequivocally that none of this would ever have happened if my two dads had been around. Then I hear something roaring behind me. To my amazement, the creature posing as a man was giving us chase. Something else was carrying me on their shoulders, but who? Someone else had picked me up. But was this big thing that was carrying me friend or foe? I couldn't be sure. Whatever was carrying me on its shoulders was holding me down with one arm. It is huge, big, hairy, lofty, powerfully strong. Its hair is long and dark, not tight and sleek like the creature I'd encountered by the lake. Soon there is no sign of my opponent, that masked man in disguise following us, as we had left him long behind us. I found myself being lowered to the ground very gently, as if I was a fine, fragile ornament that might easily break with heavy handling. I glanced through the spaces between the spruce trees. I see the comforting sight of my cabin. I've never seen a more beautiful sight in my life. It was as if for a brief moment my heart skipped with a joyful glee, like a newborn lamb. I am now a hair's breadth away from my cabin, a hair's breadth away from safety. I turn around to look at the creature that rescued me, and for a moment my mouth drops open. My eyes grow wide. This day had grown more and more bizarre with every passing second, and had more in common with a fictional novel than reality. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. My father told me they were real. He had encountered one once, but I wasn't familiar with his story. The Bigfoot was easily 9 foot tall and 800 pounds, with shoulders on her so powerful I reckon she could easily lift up a car without even breaking a sweat. She's looking at me with deep-set dark eyes that twinkle with humour. I think she's laughing at my bedeviled surprise, at my incredulous disbelief. Huputasi folakoshasana. You got yourself into quite a scrape, young man, back there. Hupuni bilanina. You do realise he wanted to eat you. He kosa fupo. He kana kopa. He's a big trickster. You know, he can change into anything he wants.
Akisa, hoponi! Nasty piece of work he is. Harshana Sila. He hasn't got a soul, that's for sure. How did you know I needed your help? Hoponi! I didn't, she told me. Hokina Sav! I heard your screams. Huputa Saka! You've got quite the pair of lungs on you. The creature spoke to me in an ancient language that I'm not acquainted with, but it was naturally translated into my head so fluidly. And as I'm well acquainted with the kids in the storybook of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, it didn't strike me at all as strange to speak to a creature in this way, as the children had spoken to the beavers and to Aslam the lion. I looked at the creature who was like Aslam, that life-saving lion in the book of The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe. I was so bemused. Thank you for helping me. Hitasa Kona. It's a pleasure, young man. Now puta sikita. Now get back home to safety. She stood there in the trees watching me return back to the cabin. I forgot all about my fishing rod and the wicker basket that I had abandoned at the fishing pier. I had forgotten it all, and I was still covered in mud and wet clothes. When I entered the house, I was thrilled to see my mother. I gave her the biggest, barest hug. I missed you, I cried as I ran to her. She was wearing her housecoat. The tears were spilling down my face without restraint. Whatever is the matter, sweetheart, said my mother, clutching me closely to her. She then notices that I'm covered with mud. She pulls away, staring at the muddy footprints on the floor in horror. Goodness gracious, where on earth have you been, George? She said, staring at me in astonishment. You're soaked to the skin. You're covered in mud. It's all over your clothes and your face. Look at you. You look as if you've been rolling in the mud. And look at me as well, she says, pulling off her housecoat that covered her sweatshirt and jeans. You've covered me with mud too. I swam in the lake, I said, deciding not to tell her the full story, as I was still struggling to get my head around it. You swam in the lake? What on earth were you doing there, George? Said my mother, growing even more bewildered. Why on earth would you go swimming in the lake? And why would you be covered in mud? It's a long story. You go and get cleaned up, sweetheart, right now. Put on some decent clothes, and then we'll have some lunch, and then you can tell me exactly what happened afterwards. Before long, my grandfather and Dad returned from town. My grandfather had not dropped down dead, nor did he have the mole removed. It's not a mole. Would you believe it after all that? Apparently it's going to go away on its own accord. There's a scientific name for this kind of a mole that looks like a mole and isn't one. The dermatologist said I got it from knocking against something really hard. It does tend to look like a malignant melanoma straight away, but it's always a false flag. Nothing to worry about. Well, that's a relief, said my mother. We all ate our meal happily together, and my mother failed to ask me about my lake adventure, so I kept my mouth tightly shut. Everything that happened during the day was so crazy, I thought that I must have imagined it all, but I know that I didn't. Grandpa Otis's curious account. I was heartily relieved not to have the dreaded malignant melanoma. I'm an old man now, rather set in my ways, and very resigned to the fact that something will one day take me. In the end, something gets us all. But I wasn't ready to go yet. I figured there were still some years left in the old dog. I hasten to say I was as fit as a fiddle, maybe not as robust as I used to be. My eyesight was dimming a little, but my hearing was as sharp as ever. Let's just say my muscular physique of my youth was now but a fragrant memory of the past, but that's all part of getting older. It goes with the territory. I had noticed when I returned home from Fairbanks, my grandson George seemed to be otherwise preoccupied, as if he was miles away from our table. It was bizarre behaviour for George. He was not given to daydreaming, and he never ate much over dinner or lunch. He didn't seem down in the dumps or subdued. He seemed almost lost in his thoughts. I did feel rather bad that I had not taken him fishing, and the guilt I felt worsened when I realised that my malignant melanoma was all but a false alarm. We could have gone fishing after all. That unprofitable trip to Fairbanks, waiting around a dermatologist's office,
had been a complete waste of time squandered. When you get to my age, time is precious. You don't know how much time you have left. So wasted trips are like an unnecessary expenditure that you can ill afford to splash out on, like buying a sports car on impulse when you know it way exceeds your budget and you can't afford it.
Not to worry, George, I had said to him. We could go fishing tomorrow if you like, if the weather is fine.
I was expecting George to run over to me enthusiastically, giving me a big impulsive hug, and say, "Really, Gramps, that will be brilliant!" But he didn't react like that. Instead, he said gingerly, "I think I'll give fishing a break for a while." I was about to cross-examine him further when Martha returned to the table with heaped plates of apple pie and cream. Let's just say that magnanimous distraction took my attention right away from my grandson, as my nose was filled with the scent of apple and cinnamon, and I got wrapped up in that sensory experience, clean forgetting about my grandson's strange words. I am a light sleeper, always have been, and for some curious reason I woke up with a start, my mind sharply remembering my grandson's perplexing comments. "I'll give fishing a break for a while, Gramps." Strange boy, I thought to myself, sitting up, scratching my head. Strange boy.
Why would George say that to me? Normally he was so excited about the prospect of going fishing. He was always telling me that he was going to catch a much bigger fish than me and his father one day, and I believed him. He was certainly better at fishing than I was at his age. I decided to get out of bed, but when I did so, every part of my body creaked, like an old chair that has got slightly unsteady legs. I slipped my long, thin, rather gnarled-looking feet into my fleece-lined slippers and slipped my arms into my velvety dressing gown. It might be spring, but it was still quite fresh at night. I was going to make myself a hot toddy. This was a great trick of mine that worked like a charm every time I had a restless night or I suffered from flu. I ambled to the kitchen, mixing 2 fingers of whiskey with 2 teaspoons of honey and 2 teaspoons of lemon juice, which I placed in a pot on the hob. It is at that precise moment I heard a peculiar shuffling sound on the front porch, as if something was moving around there. I hastily grabbed my torch and my rifle and threw open the well-oiled door, and that was when I saw her. Nothing was to prepare me for what my eyes would see. The moon was clear that night, sitting on the roof of the sky with a congenial smile, while her bright light effusively lit up the area around the cabin, so I could see the idiosyncratic creature quite clearly in the moonlight. Of course I knew what she was at once. There could be no mistake about it in my mind. It was a Bigfoot. I stood there gawking, my mouth hanging open like a flycatcher. I even rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't dreaming. I think the thing that astounded me the most was how remarkably human she was. Yes, she was covered in long flowing hair. Yes, she was gargantuan in size and girth, easily 8 foot tall, 700 pounds by my reckoning. But what I found more extraordinary than anything else was the intelligence in her deep-set dark eyes and the benevolence that accompanied her. I don't know who was more surprised, me to see her or her to see me. But she did not run away. Instead, she pointed to the fishing basket and the rod, which I recognized at once as belonging to my grandson. Then the strangest, most curious thing happened. She spoke to me in a strange language that telepathically was translated into my head. "Ipasa sana po, hasila." I brought him his rod back, and his basket, she said. "Hitasana fo." He left it by the lake. "Don't let him go fishing again on his own. Not without you with him." I nodded, as if what she was telling me was the most normal thing in the world. But then she was gone. I watched her shadowy, lofty form disappearing into the woodgrove, and I just stood there, just staring in abject awe. I returned to the kitchen. My hot toddy was boiling over on the hob. I'd need to make it a double hot toddy tonight, with even more alcohol, after my outlandish encounter with such an extraordinary, majestic creature. What did she mean I shouldn't let George go fishing unaccompanied on his own? It would seem George had a lot of explaining to do the following morning. At breakfast I asked George if he'd gone fishing without us the previous day at the lake. His face flushed bright red. He hung his head bashfully, while tears spilled down his cheeks. "I did, Gramps. I'm really sorry. I left my fishing rod and my basket by the lake, but I had to run away, you see. This monstrous thing was after me. I know he wanted to eat me. He looked like a human, but that was a mask. I know it was. He was really a giant otter. I know it's hard to believe, but I promise you it's true." George began to recount his story from the previous day. I listened to him incredulously, but I knew no matter how fictitious and far-fetched his story might sound, it was the truth. You see, I had heard of strange encounters with a trickster like this before. "You know what you saw, son," I told him. "You saw the Kushtaka. He's known as the Otter Man. He can shapeshift, take on human appearances, mimic people's voices, and he has telepathic and mind-reading abilities, which means he knows things about you. As you well know, young man, many people go missing in Alaska every year, around the Alaskan Triangle most especially. And there are many wise and astute among us that instinctively believe that the Kushtaka is behind these mystifying disappearances. He is cunning, very manipulative, a great trickster. I'm sure that is what you encountered. It seems the Bigfoot saved you from him. I hope you will have in mind not to go fishing on your own again." "Yes, Gramps, I won't, I promise." "Just so you know, your Bigfoot friend popped around last night, dropped off your basket and fishing rod for you." "She did," said George, his eyes lighting up with excitement. My son looked at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. "You saw a Bigfoot here last night. She came to our cabin. Yes, she did. A very intelligent, kind, lofty creature she was. She seemed very concerned about little George here." "Well, I will be damned," said my son, looking at me with surprise. "I'll be damned. You got to speak to a Bigfoot. Why is this not a fair world? You always get the luck, Dad. I get the short straw." My son's wife, Martha, came into the room with a big beam on her face. "I think your Bigfoot failed to mention she left 4 fresh salmon for us in the basket." My grandson ran over to the basket, pulling out the fish excitedly. "I told you she was nice. Can we have fish for breakfast?" Before long we were gathered together around the kitchen table, tucking into the most delectable, melt-in-the-mouth salmon that was swaddled in butter and garlic, brought to us courtesy of a Bigfoot. Did life get better than this? I think not. "As you know, I've also seen a Bigfoot, but not up close and personal like the two of you," said my son. "When was this, son?" I asked curiously. "I seem to remember you mentioned encountering one once." "It happened when I was building this cabin from scratch. For days on end I got the strange sense that someone was watching me from the trees. I would look behind me and stare at the trees, shake my head, tell myself my imagination was clearly playing tricks on me. And that was when I caught sight of this face peering at me from behind a tree. And I suddenly gave this thing chase. I saw it was a Bigfoot, but so fleetingly. But I remember the human face and the very long, flowing dark hair. When I continued to build our cabin, I always got the sense I was being watched. I knew it was a Bigfoot." "How extraordinary," said Martha, wiping away the garlic butter from around her mouth. "It's like that Bigfoot knew everything about us, and yet we knew nothing about her. I'm assuming it's the same Bigfoot that rescued our George." "The Bigfoot told me she rescued me because she heard me scream so loudly. Even I was surprised, Gramps, that I could scream that loud." Martha chuckled. She glanced at my son very briefly. "Remember what the nurse said at the hospital after George was born?" My son grinned. "That boy's got a fine pair of lungs on him, he has. Some things never change." Suffice to say,
My grandson George never did go fishing again on his own, but neither of us have ever forgotten our outlandish encounters with that female Bigfoot. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.